There is a tiny house right now, 440 square feet, sitting on a quarter-acre lot, that people mistake for a full-size Victorian mansion when they drive past it. Not a scaled-down version, not a cute little cottage that gestures at the style. An actual, jaw-dropping, hand-carved Victorian filigree home that happens to fit in a space smaller than most two-car garages. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you the one piece of trim on these homes that can cost more than the tiny house trailer itself, why some builders are quietly walking away from these projects, and the real 2026 price tag nobody puts in their marketing photos. Before we get into it, if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because this channel breaks down real numbers on tiny homes every single week. No sponsors, no affiliate links, just the actual builders and the actual costs. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do not miss what is coming later in this video. Because I promise you, the reveal at the end changes how you will look at every gingerbread porch you have ever seen. So let us start with the obvious question. What actually makes a tiny house Victorian filigree, and not just a regular tiny house with a coat of paint? Victorian architecture in America exploded between about 1860 and 1900, and it was never about restraint. It was about showing off what a new sawmill technology called the scroll saw could do. Before the scroll saw, wood ornamentation had to be carved by hand, one piece at a time, which meant only the wealthiest homes could afford it. Once steam-powered scroll saws became common, suddenly a carpenter could cut out elaborate lacy wood patterns in a fraction of the time, and that decorative wood trim earned the nickname gingerbread because it looked like something piped out of an icing bag onto a gingerbread house. That gingerbread trim is the signature of the style, and it shows up everywhere on a Victorian filigree tiny house. You get spandrels, which are the lacy panels that hang between porch posts. You get corbels, the decorative brackets that look like they're holding up the roof line, even when they are purely ornamental. You get finials, the little carved spikes that cap a gable or a turret. You get sunbursts tucked into gable peaks, rosettes at the corners of window casings, and sawn balusters running along the porch railing instead of plain square spindles. Layer all of that onto a steeply pitched roof, a dormer or two for extra headroom in the loft, big double-hung or bay windows, and a porch, and you've got the recipe. It helps to understand that Victorian is really an umbrella term covering several distinct substyles, and tiny house builders tend to borrow from all of them rather than committing to just one. Queen brings the turrets, the wraparound porches, and the wildly mixed roof lines. Gothic Revival brings the steep, almost church-like pitched gables and pointed arch windows. Folk Victorian, which is arguably the most common inspiration for tiny house versions, takes a simple rectangular farmhouse form and simply adds gingerbread trim, a porch, and decorative brackets on top of it, which happens to be a very practical template for a small footprint. Because you're not fighting the structure to add the ornamentation, you're layering it onto a shape that already works at tiny scale. Color plays a role too. The so-called painted lady color scheme, 3 or more contrasting paint colors used to highlight different architectural details on the same facade, became popular during the 1960s and 1970s historic preservation movement in cities like San Francisco, and it has carried straight through into how modern Victorian filigree tiny homes are marketed and sold. A body color, a trim color, and an accent color for the gingerbread itself is standard practice, because a single flat color on this much ornamentation tends to flatten all the detail you paid for. Builders who understand this will often quote paint and finishing as a separate line item, specifically because a proper multi-color Victorian paint scheme takes considerably more labor hours than a single coat rolled across a plain wall. Now here is where it gets interesting. And this is the part I want you to stick around for, because most videos about Victorian tiny houses show you pretty photos and stop there. They do not tell you which piece of that gingerbread trim quietly becomes the most expensive line item on the entire build, sometimes more expensive than the appliances, sometimes more expensive than the plumbing. I'm going to get to that specific piece and the specific dollar number a little later, so keep watching. Let us talk square footage, because Victorian filigree tiny houses tend to run a little larger than the average tiny house on wheels. A lot of builders keep these designs in the 400 to 500 square foot range rather than the 200 to 250 square foot range you see with a lot of those, and there is a practical reason for that. Victorian architecture relies on separated rooms. A real Victorian home has a parlor, a dining room, a kitchen, and bedrooms as distinct spaces, not one open concept box. Cottage Depot, a small house plan and kit company, sells a 440 square foot Victorian tiny home plan, listed under the model code TH446, built around an L-shaped layout with a genuine separate living room, bedroom, full bathroom, kitchen, dining area, and even a walk-in closet. It is designed around a small central courtyard with French doors opening out from both the living room and the bedroom, and high vaulted ceilings that make the interior feel considerably bigger than the footprint suggests. That plan is also sold as a fully independent backyard unit, meaning it can function as an accessory dwelling unit, a rental, or a standalone home on its own lot, not just a novelty structure. The courtyard layout in particular is worth paying attention to because it solves a problem that a lot of tiny homes never solve well, which is privacy for outdoor space. A wraparound porch on a small lot is visible to the whole street. A courtyard tucked between two wings of an L-shaped footprint gives you private outdoor square footage that functions almost like an extra room, without adding a single square foot to the taxable structure in most jurisdictions. Here is where we get honest about numbers, because this is where a lot of Victorian tiny house content falls apart. Pretty renderings do not tell you what you are actually going to spend. Starting with the DIY kit route, Cottage Depot prices the material construction cost for that 440 square foot L-shaped Victorian plan, the TH446, at $34,000. That number is materials only, not labor, and it assumes you're either building it yourself or hiring your own crew separately. The plan set itself, which includes architectural, structural, electrical, HVAC, and plumbing drawings along with material specifications and load calculations, is sold separately or bundled with the pricing set at a discount, which brings the combined plan and pricing package in under what it would cost to buy each one individually. If you want something more ornate, Cottage Depot also offers what they call the Victorian Gothic cottage, which is directly inspired by 19th century architect Andrew Jackson Downing, one of the people most responsible for popularizing this look in the first place. That design uses full-size gingerbread and wood detail patterns, 12-foot lofted beam ceilings, a wet bar, a walk-in closet, and an enclosed pantry linen closet. The company is upfront that this particular design is more difficult to build than their standard plans and is really intended for an experienced DIY builder or a professional crew, which tells you something important. The more authentic the filigree detailing gets, the steeper the labor curve becomes, and that difficulty rating is not marketing caution. It is a genuine reflection of how many more linear feet of custom trim, how many more roof intersections, and how many more finished carpentry decisions go into a Gothic-style build compared to a simpler folk Victorian shell. Now, if you would rather buy a finished, road-ready unit instead of building one, Pacifica Tiny Homes out of the San Francisco Bay Area builds an RV-certified park model called the Tiny Victorian, starting at $54,900 for the 18-foot base model. These come in lengths from 18 to 30 feet, all 8 feet wide, and they offer an upgraded Tiny Victorian 2.0 with 2 lofts and a downstairs bedroom for people who want more livable square footage without sacrificing the Victorian silhouette. Because these are RV certified, they can be financed and insured more easily in a lot of states, which is a meaningful practical advantage over a fully custom stick-built version, since a large share of tiny house lenders and insurers still price risk based on RVIA or similar third-party certification rather than a one-off custom build. There are also builders working at both ends of the spectrum. On the more affordable end, there have been Victorian-style tiny homes on wheels listed starting around $39,000 from smaller regional builders, typically with a more compact loft and a simpler single-color trim package to hit that lower price point. On the more specialized end, structurally insulated panel builders have produced Victorian-styled units in the low 200 square foot range, originally listed in the mid-50,000s and later discounted into the low 40,000s, which shows you how much price movement exists in this niche, depending on how motivated a small builder is to move inventory. SIP construction is worth flagging on its own, because structurally insulated panels give you a tighter building envelope and better insulation values than typical stick framing, which matters a lot on a small structure where every wall is a bigger percentage of your total surface area relative to your square footage than it would be on a full-sized house. Quick question for you, and I actually want you to answer this in the comments before you keep watching. If you were building a Victorian Filigree tiny house, would you go the DIY kit route to save money, or would you pay more for a finished, road-ready unit so you do not have to deal with the gingerbread trim yourself? Drop a comment either way. I read every single one, and it genuinely helps me figure out what to cover next on this channel. Alright, now let us get into the number I promised you at the start of this video. Remember that gingerbread trim we talked about earlier. Here is the part almost nobody explains clearly. Basic trim molding installation in 2026 runs about $8.25 to $12.37 per linear foot for a straightforward, in stock, mid-range installation. That is fine for baseboards and door casing. That is not what you are paying for authentic Victorian gingerbread. Custom gingerbread fretwork, the kind of hand-cut or CNC-cut scrollwork that actually reads as authentic Victorian on camera and up close, is a completely different category of product. Specialty millwork shops that focus specifically on this style, some of which have been doing it for decades, build spandrels, corbels, finials, sunbursts, rosettes, plinth blocks, sawn balusters, and custom gables as bespoke architectural pieces, not off-the-shelf trim. Because every pattern can be fully custom to your exact dimensions, pricing is quoted per project rather than per linear foot, and a single elaborate gable ornament or a full run of spandrels across a wraparound porch can realistically run into the thousands of dollars once you add the labor to fabricate and install properly. On the resale and salvage market, even a single antique spandrel with corbels, not even new, can sell for several $100s on its own, which gives you a sense of how much value is baked into that one architectural element, even secondhand. So here is the real reveal. On a lot of Victorian Filigree tiny house builds, the gingerbread trim package, the spandrels, the brackets, the gable ornaments, the porch balusters, ends up being one of the single most expensive line items in the entire exterior budget, sometimes rivaling the cost of the windows or the roofing. Builders have two real options to manage that cost. Option 1. Source solid-wood custom fretwork from a specialty shop, which looks the most authentic and can last for decades if properly painted and maintained, but costs the most and requires repainting every several years to prevent rot, especially in the more intricate cutout sections where water tends to sit after rain. Option 2. Use PVC or polyurethane gingerbread trim, which is manufactured to replicate the same lacy scrollwork patterns but resists rot, insects, and weather without repainting for a very long time, and typically costs meaningfully less than solid-wood custom work while still holding sharp detail. That is exactly why you will see more and more Victorian Filigree tiny houses built after 2020 using PVC trim instead of hand-carved wood. It is not because builders got lazy. It is because the material genuinely performs better on a small structure that takes the same weather exposure as a full-sized house, but has a much smaller budget to protect it. There's a middle option too, worth mentioning honestly, which is buying stock gingerbread patterns instead of fully custom ones. A lot of millwork suppliers sell pre-designed gable decorations and running trim in standard sizes that you can order off a catalog rather than commissioning a one-off pattern. It will not be dimensionally perfect to your exact gable width the way a fully custom piece is, but it closes a huge amount of the price gap between basic trim molding and full custom fretwork. And for a lot of tiny house budgets, it is the honest sweet spot between authenticity and affordability. It is worth spending a minute on how these floor plans actually function day to day, because Victorian style is not just an exterior costume bolted onto a generic box. The separated room philosophy we talked about earlier changes how you live in the space compared to an open concept tiny home. A dedicated kitchen with real wall boundaries means cooking smells and mess stay contained instead of dominating your entire living area. A separate bedroom, even a small one, means you're not sleeping in the same sight line as your kitchen sink, which sounds minor until you have actually lived in an open concept tiny home for a few months. The trade-off is that separated rooms use square footage less efficiently than open concept design, which is exactly why these plans tend to land closer to 400 to 500 square feet, rather than the smaller 200 square foot builds that rely on one continuous space to feel larger than it is. The vertical emphasis we mentioned earlier also does real interior work. Vaulted or lofted ceilings under a steep Victorian roofline, sometimes reaching 12 feet at the peak as we saw with the Gothic cottage model, change how a small room feels psychologically. A flat 8-foot ceiling on a 400 square foot footprint can feel compressed. A 12-foot vaulted ceiling on that same footprint reads as spacious, even though the usable floor area has not changed at all. Combine that with tall double-hung or bay windows, which are historically accurate to the style and also happen to pull in far more natural light than a standard tiny house window, and you get an interior that photographs and feels considerably larger than the square footage on paper. Now, because this channel does not do hype without balance, let us talk about the real drawbacks. First, complexity. Builders are explicit that the more ornate Victorian plans are harder to build than a standard tiny house shell, and that translates directly into either a longer DIY timeline or a higher labor bill if you're hiring out. Second, maintenance. If you go the solid wood trim route, you're signing up for periodic repainting to protect that investment, which is an ongoing cost most tiny house buyers do not budget for, and that cost recurs every several years for as long as you own the home. Third, weight and transport. If you're building this style onto a trailer rather than a foundation, all that ornamental trim, the steep roof, and the dormers add weight and wind resistance that a flatter, simpler tiny house design does not have to deal with, which can affect what tow vehicle you need and how the structure performs on the road. And it is worth confirming your trailer's rated axle weight against the finished build weight before you commit to a fully ornamented exterior. And fourth, zoning. A lot of the more elaborate Victorian filigree builds, especially the Gothic cottage-style plans, are really designed as foundation-built accessory dwelling units rather than true movable thos. So if mobility is your priority, you need to check that against the specific plan before you fall in love with the photos. Local historic district rules can also cut the other way in some towns, where a Victorian filigree structure is actually welcomed or even required in a historic overlay zone, while a modern flat-roof tiny home would face pushback, so it genuinely pays to check your local planning department before you assume this style will be harder to permit everywhere. So here's where that leaves us. A Victorian filigree tiny house is not the cheapest way into tiny living, and it is not the easiest build on this channel by a long shot. But square foot for square foot, it might be the style that gets the most visual impact per dollar once that gingerbread trim goes up, because nothing else in the tiny house world makes 440 square feet look like it belongs on a postcard. Whether you go the $34,000 DIY kit route, the $54,900 finished park model route, or something custom between, the numbers are real, the builders are real, and the trim decision, wood versus PVC, is genuinely the single biggest factor in both your budget and how this house ages over the next 20 years. If this video actually taught you something you did not know about Victorian tiny homes, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells YouTube to put this in front of more people who would actually appreciate it. And if you want the next deep dive, I have got more historic architecture styles adapted for tiny living coming, from cordwood construction to the Ontario Regency cottage. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you catch it the moment it goes live. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.